Okay, welcome everyone to this BAPT conference on personality type and vulnerability by Susan Storm. My name's Nick Toker. I'm one of the BAPT board members. The BAPT board are proud to confirm sponsorship of this session by Personality Hacker, which is run by Joel Mark Witt and Antonia Dodge. And we greatly appreciate the support from Personality Hacker. You can access further information about Personality Hacker by clicking on the link to their website, besides this session's information on our conference website. In this session, we're going to look at how each of the 16 personality types experience vulnerability, and we will explore situations that can unsettle each personality type and make them feel incompetent. We will look for ways to embrace vulnerability and without getting overwhelmed. Once again, welcome Susan, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. I am really excited to be here. I see so many people I have admired and learned from for many years. And so it's a huge honor to be able to be here and share some of the things that I've learned about type over the last 8 years of blogging about type. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Susan Storm. I'm the founder of a website called psychologyjunkie.com. And I'm also a certified MBTI practitioner. And I've spent many years talking to people with various personality types and surveying people with the different personality types and learning all that I can, with the goal that personality type could be useful for people in everyday situations. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so that y'all can see the slides that I made for this presentation. All right. So hopefully that, Nicholas, do you see everything okay?
Yes, I do, and I've pinned you as well so we can see you and your slides.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. So this session could really take 2 days to go through. I feel like I need a whole weekend session to go into type and vulnerability, but I'm going to try to give the highlights of this today in this 1 hour that we have, because I think it's a really important topic. So many times in our personal relationships, we judge other people because we are maybe more comfortable with something than they are. Maybe we're stepping on a source of insecurity for them, but it's not a source of insecurity for ourselves. So we may not understand why they're reacting in maybe a defensive way or a negative way to a situation that we would handle more gracefully, or vice versa. We might feel really vulnerable about something, and the person that we're dealing with feels totally fine with that. And we feel judged because they expect us to handle the situation differently. So understanding vulnerability and insecurity, I think, is a really important part of having happier relationships as people. Here's just a brief look at what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're just going to give an overview of what is vulnerability, because it can mean different things to different people. A quick overview of the cognitive function stack. I know that many of you here know all about the cognitive function stack and really don't need any kind of refresher on that, but I don't want to exclude anyone who is maybe newer to type and doesn't know. We're also going to talk about the tertiary function and the inferior function and how those impact what we feel vulnerable around. Then we'll open up for any questions that anyone might have, followed by the results from some surveying I did of the 16 personality types. One of the great benefits that I have of having been a blogger for 8 years is that I accumulated a lot of email subscribers. I have about 120,000 right now. And because of that, I can survey large amounts of people. I have them segmented into the 16 different personality types so that I can survey people and get a lot of information that way. And so we're going to go over some of the results of surveying I did about the personality types and what causes them to feel vulnerable, as well as what helps them when they do feel vulnerable, because I think it's really, really interesting to see how different the responses were for the 16 different types. And then we are also going to talk about some ways to step into vulnerability in a way that isn't overwhelming. And throughout that process, we'll have a couple moments for any questions that people might have as well. So firstly, getting to basics, what is vulnerability in the first place? Vulnerability, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is being capable of being physically or emotionally wounded or open to attack or damage. Synonyms for this include insecure, unsafe, exposed, or defenseless. So vulnerability is usually talking about something pretty negative. If you have a vulnerable security system in a bank situation, then that would be really, really bad. If your computer is vulnerable to viruses, that's a really bad thing. So when people feel vulnerable, they feel like they are unsafe, that they're open to attack. And so we try to avoid it at all costs most of the time in our lives. The issue becomes that vulnerability is often kind of the dark tunnel that leads to a brighter future. It's important to be able to pass through it to some degree as people. Brene Brown said, vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. And Chris Jamie said, to share your weakness is to make yourself vulnerable. To make yourself vulnerable is to show your strength. So there's important, it's very important to become comfortable as a human with a certain degree of vulnerability. And even though everything inside of us is saying, no, don't do that. It's the worst thing you could possibly do for yourself. You're not going to be safe. You're going to be exposed. You're going to, you could expose yourself to attack in some way. It's very important for us to be able to approach life with a willingness to be vulnerable at different times, because that's often how we grow as people. So now I just need to see, for some reason or other, I lost the little like menu that allows me to switch slides. Let's see here. Oh, here we go. So what does type have to do with vulnerability? And a lot of the vulnerability we feel as people in regards to our personality type stems from the tertiary and inferior functions of our personality type. And we're going to talk about why that is, as well as what some other great leaders in type have said about that. I want to give credit where credit is due. So one of my idols in type is Mark Hunsicker. He wrote the book Depth Typology, the guide map to becoming who we are. And I love this book for exploring the issue of vulnerability, because a lot of the areas he talks a lot about how our tertiary and inferior function, as well as our shadow functions, impact how vulnerable we feel in different situations. And he takes a lot of what John Beebe wrote and makes it, I think, a little bit easier to understand and a little more structured. Also got a lot of information about type and vulnerability from Marie-Louise von Franz, who wrote Lectures on Jung's Typology. This is an amazing book if you ever want to get really deep into the inferior function. Many of you have probably read it already, but this is one I reference time and time again when I'm trying to understand type. And then, of course, I can't go through this without thanking John Beebe, who wrote Energies and Patterns in Psychological Type. He really opened the door to a lot more depth, I believe, in understanding of type. All right, so let's dive in. I know that most of you probably know what the cognitive function stack is. So I know this is probably going to be a little basic, but I don't want to exclude anyone who might be a little newer to type. So I'm showing here an example of an INTP cognitive function stack. Each of us has 2 extroverted and 2 introverted functions in our primary function stack. So these 4 functions are essentially kind of the ego of our personality and how we see ourselves. We see these functions as part of ourselves. We all have access to all 8 cognitive functions, but these 4, in this case, if you're an INTP, are the ones that you look at and you go, this is me. I associate this with who I am as a person. So there's a dominant function. In the case of the INTP, it's introverted thinking, an auxiliary function, tertiary and inferior, and a lot of the vulnerability we experience stems from issues with the tertiary and inferior functions of your personality. And those functions are going to be different for each personality type. But I'm not going to get really into that, because otherwise that could take up the whole entire hour. And I think many of you have already know about the basics of the cognitive function stack. So briefly, let's go over the archetype for each cognitive function. So the dominant function, I like to call the hero, and also I got that from Mark Hunziker's book. This function is at the core of your ego and is your most easy to develop and control. Understanding and differentiating your dominant function is an important part of self-actualization. And Mark Hunziker wrote, if you notice that you or someone else has shifted into a leading the charge mode, as if carrying out a dramatic banner ahead of the troops, with complete confidence in the rightness of the action or position, and serious, therefore, that others will be compelled to follow, you've probably seen the energy signature of the hero/heroine. So for me, as an ENTJ, when I feel the most confident about what I'm doing and the most sure of where I'm going with something, it's usually when I have some kind of a business strategy or plan for how to troubleshoot a problem. But it's different. My ESTP husband, his hero would be extroverted sensation. Nicholas, as an ESFP, would also be extroverted sensation hero. So a lot of that would be taking action, moving forward with energy and enthusiasm, and living in the present and seeing opportunities that can be grasped right now. The auxiliary function is also called the mother-father. This is the function that supports us and others and promotes growth. Personality Hacker calls it the co-pilot. This function helps to balance our dominant function, and it also is what we use when we comfort and nurture other people. Mark Hunziker says, recognizing this archetype's energy signature is usually a simple matter of noticing supportive, nurturing, positive, enabling, and protective behavior. When the parent becomes inflated and when we become possessed by the archetype, it's a matter of being overprotective or too permissive, patronizing, or teaching or parenting when it's not appropriate to take on that role. So this is the nurturing, protective side of us. And one thing I like about what Mark Hunziker and BB did with the function stack is that he clarified that everyone has a way that they nurture and care and support others. A lot of times we describe maybe feeling types as the kind, thoughtful types, and thinking types as the harsh, get things done types, or the logical types, but maybe more heartless. And what I like about the 8-function BB model is that it shows us that each of us has a mother-father side of ourselves that comforts, protects, and nurtures other people. It just may show up differently depending on what your personality type is. Now let's dive into the tertiary function, or the eternal child. This is the one that we often wield in a playful, exploratory, or creative way. The tertiary function is often called the relief function by typologists, and that's because we can use it to relax, calm down, and take the pressure off our often overused dominant or auxiliary functions. This child function is often how we like to be comforted. So the auxiliary function is how we comfort and nurture others, but the child function is often how we want to be comforted. For example, if your tertiary function is extroverted feeling, you might want to be comforted by receiving empathy, affirmation, and harmonious acceptance. If your tertiary function is introverted sensing, you might want to be comforted by receiving practical support or by being given reminders of ways you succeeded in the past or good memories from the past. So another example, as an ENTJ, my tertiary function is introverted feeling. And the people who have comforted me the most in my life, who have made a really significant impact on me, have been people who have, ENTJ would be tertiary extroverted sensing. I had a mind blip there for a minute. But one of the ways that I like to be taken care of is by being able to have a great experience, or being able to act in the moment and not overthink things as much. And that's something that my ESTP husband is really good at. Mark Hunziker says, the eternal child tends to manifest in manic cycles. 1 minute, the king of the world, and the next, a withdrawn and timid, wounded child. Good integration of the child into the ego means allowing ourselves to be playful, silly, irresponsible, and vulnerable when appropriate and healthy. So right away, we can see here where the tertiary function can be a great source of vulnerability. We like to play around with it. We like to get creative with it. We like to experiment with it. But when we get criticism about our abilities in this realm, then we can retreat really, really fast and feel very, very vulnerable and ashamed. Now we're going to the inferior function. The inferior function is intrinsically linked to the dominant function. It is one of the last functions to become assimilated into the ego, and it's also one of the functions we feel the most vulnerability around. We often suppress this function or give into it when we're severely stressed and have overused our other functions. It can be a source of shame or enlightenment, and it may take a great deal of time before we feel comfortable using it consciously. We tend to admire people who use this function well, but personally, we often find using this function a waste of time. So I've heard some typologists call the inferior function the aspiring function, and I think that's an amazing name for it, because we do associate the inferior function with ourselves. It is part of the ego, but it also feels perpetually out of reach. Like it's this foggy mist we keep trying to grab, but we can never actually hold it in our hands. And so we wish and aspire to use it well, but it often feels like this thing we just can't quite master as much as we associate it with ourselves. But at the same time, when we have situations where we could work on it, we often push it to the side and go, oh, it's not important. I need to do things that revolve around my top function or my top two functions. So as an ENTJ, for me, it's introverted feeling is the inferior function. And so when I have situations where I should pull away from the world and introspect on what's really meaningful to me as an individual, I often go, I'll figure that out some other time. Instead, I need to focus on tasks that need to be done, strategies I need to formulate, and objectives I need to pursue, rather than getting into understanding myself as a person. And a great example of that is why it took so long for me to figure out that I was mistyped and had the wrong personality type, is I was constantly pushing self-understanding, kicking that down the road. Marie-Louise von Franz said of the inferior function, in most normal societies, people cover up their inferior function with a persona. One of the main reasons why one develops a persona is so as not to expose inferiorities, especially the inferiorities of the fourth function. All right, so let's talk about the eternal child again, just a little bit. It is playful, fun-loving, irresponsible, creative, and it's extremely vulnerable. This is something many of you probably already know, but it's very vulnerable, and it is the antithesis to the responsible adult, which is your auxiliary function. So for me, my auxiliary function is introverted intuition, but my tertiary is extroverted sensation, and they kind of are at war with each other at times. But when I'm in a place of exploring the eternal child, I'm very playful and fun, and I like to go out and do exciting sensory things like go to Disney World or go on a trip or try new foods or dance or play Beat Saber with my husband, whatever it is, these kind of silly, playful, creative sensory activities. And then the inferior function is the part of us which we expect a great deal, but delivers much less, which can often lead to shame. It often seems to have a life of its own, and it tends to make us feel embarrassed, incompetent, or ashamed. Now, we can grow through our lives and become more comfortable with the inferior function, which is part of what we'll be talking about today. But especially in early life or in midlife, this is a function that tends to be something that perpetually disappoints us because we want to be able to do more with it than we can easily. I believe that this is a quote by John Beebe, but I think I forgot to put his name on this, so I need to fix that. He says, "A man's anima is not the dragon that the hero seeks to slay, but it is the dangerous and seductive sorceress that he meets on his journey, who preys on his areas of vulnerability and with whom he must find a way to come to terms if he is to fulfill his quest." So we want to be able to use this, but it often is like our Achilles heel. And this is an enormous quote. I know there's so many quotes in here. Marie-Louise von Franz said, "Another typical aspect of the inferior function, which is also connected with its unadaptedness and primitiveness, is its touchiness and tyranny. Most people, when their inferior function is in any way touched upon, become terribly childish. They can't stand the slightest criticism and always feel attacked. Here they are uncertain of themselves, with that naturally they tyrannize everybody around them because everybody has to walk carefully. If you want to say something about another person's inferior function, it is like walking on eggs. People cannot stand any criticism there. One must wait for the right moment, for a peaceful atmosphere, and then carefully, with a long introductory speech, one might get across some slight criticism about the inferior function. And she gave an example of being in a car with a dominant introverted intuitive type. And they couldn't figure out why the car wouldn't go. They were pressing on the gas and nothing was happening. And they were going to all this work, but they had never actually started the car. And she knew she could point it out, but it would be taken very badly by this dominant introverted intuitive type. They would say, of course I've turned on the car, and then it would lead to all this vulnerability. So instead, she kept looking for other ways that this guy could, this NI dominant type could figure out what was wrong with the car till he, on his own terms, figured out he hadn't turned the car on. But because she knew she was going to have this eruption of vulnerability from the person if she just said, hey, you didn't turn on the car. So that was an example of how people can be very sensitive around their inferior function or any criticism involving that function. Because of time, I'm going to go ahead and move forward with this. So how does vulnerability show up in people's tertiary and inferior functions? And this is where I go into the poll that I gave the people in my email list. Of the people in my email list, I got 6,723 responses to this poll about what makes you feel the most insecure. So here are some of the options that I gave people for situations where they might feel the most insecure. Giving and receiving criticism, managing people, breaking large tasks into manageable pieces, noise and overstimulation, getting emotional around people, comforting someone who is emotional, logical debate or argument, focusing on a lot of details, predictability, troubleshooting a complex problem, being alone for long, dealing with change, planning for the future, and being around a lot of people. I tried to find things that might be associated with the inferior functions of various types or just type preferences in general, so that I could understand if there were patterns among the 16 types of things that would make them feel vulnerable. And I also looked for feedback from people who sent me a lot of emails about specific situations that made them feel vulnerable. And then I also sent out another poll that was what restores your confidence when you feel vulnerable? What helps you to get back on your feet again and move forward during situations where you feel vulnerable or insecure? And here I put 13 options: deep breathing, meditation, listening to music, talking to a friend, getting away from people, playing a game, watching television, visualization or imagination, exercising, revisiting a favorite pastime, prayer or spiritual guidance, hugs or physical affection, or journaling. Now, I know that I'm kind of moving through these slides fairly quickly. If anybody would like a PDF of all these slides, just send me an email, which I'll give you my email at the end of this, because I can send all of this to you, and a lot more information is on there than we'll probably be able to get through in 1 hour. Actually, before I move forward, because I'm getting ahead of myself here, does anyone have any questions they want to ask before I get into the results of the polls? Any questions at all? All right, I don't see anything. I don't know if you're seeing anything, Nicholas.
No, nothing.
Okay.
So
all right. Okay, awesome. So let's take a look at starting with NFJs, because they have the same cognitive functions, but in a slightly different order. So their top insecurities, the ones that got the most votes, were the top one for it was in top 1 or 2 for both of them, was giving or receiving criticism. Also noise and overstimulation and focusing on a lot of details. ENFJs also rated being alone a lot and logical debate or argument. Those were their top 5. So logical debate or argument, being alone a lot, lots of details, stimulation, and criticism. So they had 14 options, but those 5 were the ones that got the most votes. And then INFJs also had unexpected change and being around a lot of people. So some of the results were really predictable. ENFJs being alone a lot was in the top 5 for almost all of them, except for the ENTJs and ESTJs. For introverts, being around a lot of people was, I believe, out of 7 of the 8 introverted types, being alone a lot was the number 1 source of insecurity for all the introverted types. So, I mean, not being alone a lot, being around a lot of people was the number 1 source of insecurity. So being in crowds, being surrounded by a lot of people for most introverts, unsurprisingly, was a source of insecurity. But you can also see how the tertiary and inferior functions could play a part in these specific insecurities. Noise and overstimulation and focusing on a lot of details. These are things that people with sensing perceiving preferences usually have an easier time with. Being married to an ESTP, I see this every day, where he can be dealing with lots of different details or be in a really crowded, noisy place, and he's just fine. Whereas for me, I'm like dying and can't wait to get out of that situation. But you can also see with ENFJs, logical debate or argument showed up as got a lot of votes for being a major source of insecurity. And this doesn't mean that ENFJs aren't logical or that they can't have a good debate, but being called upon to bring up, to really debate something and get into the logic of something could be something that makes them feel really, really vulnerable. Then I'm contrasting that with ESTPs and ISTPs because they have the same functions, but in the opposite order. So their top insecurities were getting emotional around people, comforting someone who is emotional, planning for the future, and predictability. ESTPs also voted giving or receiving criticism, and ISTPs voted being around a lot of people. And this was interesting because all the thinking types put getting emotional around people and comforting someone who is emotional as top sources of insecurity. Comforting someone who is emotional was never rated as a big source of insecurity for the feeling types, which makes sense because they're more in touch with the emotional realm than most thinking types are and feel a little bit more confident dealing with interpersonal emotional experiences and things like that. I found it interesting, ESTPs and ENTPs were the only 2 thinking types who put giving or receiving criticism high up, that got a lot of votes for giving or receiving criticism. And I believe that when you have tertiary extroverted feeling, which is what ENTPs and ESTPs have, there's a lot of sensitivity around how you're perceived by other people and your interactions with other people. And so giving or receiving criticism can feel very vulnerable, especially if it relates to how you are being received by other people. And I do think that there's an element of the eternal child extroverted feeling that comes into play with that. But you can also see that STPs voted planning for the future. That was one that got a lot of votes for STPs as a source of insecurity. And sensing perceivers like to live in the moment. They like to focus on what can be done now. And I've heard many, many sensing perceivers say that they don't like to plan for the future. They don't really want to spend a lot of time envisioning the future because anything could change. So why waste a lot of time trying to map out something that could change at any moment? So it feels a little bit useless to them or a little trivial for them to spend a lot of time mapping out the future. So that all adds up. These sources of insecurity, we can see how they align with people's type preferences. But then we looked at ways to restore confidence. For ENFJs and INFJs, listening to music, talking to a friend, prayer or spiritual guidance, and visualization and imagination ranked very highly, as well as hugs and physical affection for ENFJs and getting away from people for INFJs. Literally every introvert getting away from people was very, very important in order to get back to a state of security and confidence. Interestingly, all the intuitive types gave a lot of votes to visualization and imagination. It was in the top 5 for every intuitive personality type, but it was not in the top 5 for any of the sensing types. So again, you can see the type preferences in that way. And so I think there's a lot of practical implications for knowing these kinds of things, because sometimes when we're trying to comfort somebody, say you're an INFJ and you're trying to comfort an ESTP, you might try to comfort them by using prayer or spiritual guidance, or let's imagine a different future. And that's going to actually make the ISTP potentially feel a lot worse than they would have felt otherwise. So knowing what works for the different types is really, really helpful, I think, in a practical way. And then for ESTPs and ISTPs, the top ways to restore confidence were listening to music, exercising, playing a game, hugs and physical affection, talking to a friend, and getting away from people. So all of these things are very realistic. Music, exercise, game playing, hugs, talking to a friend, getting away from people. Whereas you'll notice with the intuitives, there's a lot of preference for visualization, prayer, spiritual guidance, specifically that one with the NF types. Whereas for the STPs, it's all very tactile. They want to actually do something. And also, interestingly, STPs were the STPs and the INTPs, those 3, were the only types who voted playing a game as like a top source of restoring confidence. For all the feeling types, playing a game was the last thing on the that got the least votes among all the options. There were 13 options, and all the feeling types playing a game was right at the very bottom. But ESTPs, ISTPs, and INTPs playing a game was in the top 5. And so I thought that was interesting, and it wasn't really very surprising. I'm married to an ESTP. I know I keep using him as an example, but when he's really stressed, he wants to go play a game, and that helps him to calm himself down and then get back into a better frame of mind. And I think that also aligns with those type preferences. A lot of game playing involves figuring out how systems work, and it involves, like for video games, it involves taking action and paying attention to details. So it makes sense to me that STPs would see that as a way of restoring their confidence in a situation. Now, I've done this for every single personality type, and if I go through all of them, we'll run out of time. So like I said, if anyone wants all of these slides, please let me know and I can send you all of them. I think it's really interesting and really helpful in understanding how different people cope with insecurity and vulnerability. We'll just do one more grouping here. This person looks pretty upset right now. So these are the ENTJs and INTJs. Their top insecurities were getting emotional around people, comforting someone who's emotional, predictability, dealing with a lot of details. And then predictably, ENTJs also voted being alone a lot, while INTJs voted being around a lot of people. So again, you can see some of those type preferences in there. The intuitive types don't really like dealing with lots of tangible details. And when they have to pay attention to a lot of them, it can feel very overwhelming. I mean, I'm sure most of you do know that, but it's interesting to see it show up in these big numbers. And then anything involving emotions. I know for me, as an ENTJ, the worst thing that could possibly happen is me getting emotional around other people. Like, just shoot me now, please. That's like all I want when I'm getting emotional around people. And then I contrasted that with the ESFPs and ISFPs. Their top insecurities were giving or receiving criticism, planning for the future, noise and overstimulation. And they also wrote getting emotional around others, but it was lower in the top 5. And then ESFPs voted being alone a lot, and ISFPs voted being around a lot of people. So this also, you can see where this aligns with type preferences. Planning for the future was something that none of the Sensi perceivers really enjoyed that was a source of insecurity for all the sensing perceiving types. Interestingly, getting emotional around others got more votes from people with preferences for introverted feeling than votes for people with preferences for extroverted feeling. And I would like to do more research on that to see what the pattern is, but it seems like people with introverted feeling are more guarded about showing their emotions than people with extroverted feeling, at least from this. And I think that would align with what Isabel Briggs-Meyer said about introverted feeling being like a fur-lined coat. It can look very cold on the outside sometimes, but it's very warm underneath. And I think that it would make sense that people with introverted feeling preferences would be a little bit more guarded about their emotional reactions to things. But planning for the future, that's something that people with intuitive judging preferences, they enjoy envisioning and hypothesizing about what could happen in 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years. Whereas sensing perceiving types, they want to focus on what can we do right now. So spending a lot of time strategizing about the future would be forcing them to rely on functions that aren't their top two. It would be like introverted intuition or extroverted thinking. And they would rather go do something now. Why waste all this time thinking about tomorrow when today is going to waste? And then ways to restore confidence for ENTJs and INTJs. The top votes for them were getting away from people, exercising, listening to music, and visualization imagination. ENTJs also listed talking to a friend, and INTJs also mentioned meditating. Again, you'll see that intuition preference coming through in their desire to visualize and imagine. That's just a great way for intuitives to get out of the rut of feeling insecure and vulnerable, is to imagine a situation maybe where they've overcome this current problem. I got a lot of emails from INTJs actually who talked about when they feel insecure, they just need to go into a dark room, close the door, close their eyes, and just like focus on their breathing and let their imagination and visualize them overcoming the current problem. But they have to get away from everybody else. They have to shut out stimulation in order to really feel like they can do that process. And so I think that was really interesting. And also INFJs mentioned that as well, that desire to just get away, shut out the lights, shut the door, and be able to imagine a different future than the one where they're scared and the one where they're feeling vulnerable and afraid and unprotected. For ESFPs and ISFPs, the top ways to restore confidence were listening to music, talking to a friend, hugs and physical affection, and getting away from people. ESFPs also listed exercise, and ISFPs also listed prayer and spiritual guidance. It was interesting that all the extroverted types did have getting away from people and talking to a friend in their top 5 ways of dealing with vulnerability and insecurity. So it's like they need some of each thing. The only 2 extroverted types who didn't list getting away from people were ESFJs and ENFJs, the 2 extroverted feeling dominant types. Getting away from people was not in there. That did not get a lot of votes from them at all as a way of dealing with insecurity or vulnerability. So I could go through all these slides, but we'll run out of time. Does anyone have any questions about any of this before we move on?
Susan, can you tell us a little bit more about the people who were surveyed? How old were they? Men, women, any of those demographic detail would be really interesting.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't tell you male or female differences on any of them. I got the surveys from a variety of places. My email list was the main source. So when people sign up for my email list, they take a personality questionnaire and then they start getting emails specifically for their type. And that allows me to segment them into those specific groupings. Like this, I'll email just the INFJs today. And then I also survey people in my social media followers, among my social media followers as well. I wanted to keep it fairly anonymous so that people could feel comfortable giving their answers and not feel like they're being, seen or tracked or anything like that. People feel pretty obviously guarded about talking about their vulnerability. So really that's all I can say, is that they're people who took, for the most part, they're people who took my personality questionnaire and got sorted into those different personality type categories.
Thanks.
I would love to have more information though as well, like demographic wise. Any other questions? All right, if not, I will go ahead and move on. And if there was, and I'm moving too quickly, just let us know. All right, so I'm going to skip past all these because we will totally run out of time. Here's where I just noticed the interesting patterns. Like I said before, STPs and INTPs were the only types to choose playing a game as a coping mechanism. And feeling types chose hugs and physical affection much more than thinking types. It was hugs and physical affection was often in the top 5 for feeling types, and very rarely, I don't think it was, I think the only thinking types who chose hugs and physical affection were the ESTPs and maybe the ENTPs. A lot of this information we've been over. So perceivers and extroverts chose predictability as a big source of insecurity, and EP types in particular ranked that higher as a source of insecurity than any other type. So an interesting thing I noticed was that all of the EF types, so all the extroverts and feelers, put a ton of votes in for giving and receiving criticism. That was the number one source of insecurity for all of them, except for ENFPs, who had predictability as their number one source of insecurity. So, if you're dealing with an ENFP and you're an ISFJ, and as an ISFJ, you really like to have stability and predictability, you might try to help an ENFP by stabilizing their life. Well, that's the last thing in the world that they want, because predictability is their number one source of insecurity. So I thought that was interesting. SJ types, sensing judging types, were much more likely to pick dealing with change as a source of insecurity than other types. And that, again, aligns with the type preferences. Sensing judging types like to know what's going to happen. They like to be prepared. And they like familiarity and routine. So dealing with change, it makes sense that those were the types that were most likely to pick that as a source of insecurity. And they were also, sensing thinking judges were also the type most likely to pick revisiting a favorite pastime as a coping tool. That was in the top 5 for both of the STJ types. So let's move on here to why should we try to experience vulnerability at all? I mean, if it feels so unsafe and if it feels so negative and so terrifying, why should we try to put ourselves in situations where we would need to feel that? Everything inside of us is going to tell us to run away and go back to our comfort zone, especially now in a world where we can really individualize our lives to make us feel comfortable. I mean, when we listen to music, we don't have to wait for the right song to come on. We can just create a perfect playlist individualized to our tastes. But why should we break out of that comfort zone and try to embrace vulnerability? And again, it comes down to personal growth and being able to really experience all that life has to offer and to be a mature individual, as well as when you don't work on the inferior function in your life, when you're constantly repressing that, as many of you know, it tends to just bubble up later in a really terrible way that throws your whole life out of balance. So the more we repress the sides of ourselves that can make us feel vulnerable, the more they can come back and attack us when we least expect it. And so being able to deal with a certain amount of vulnerability is the only way to really grow in life. And so we shouldn't customize our lives entirely around our preferences. Otherwise, we might just be living in an echo chamber of one-sidedness. So I'm sorry, I'm skipping past so many of these things. All right, so I put down some simple ways to incorporate the different functions. And I think I accidentally jumped past some of them here. Okay. So simple ways to incorporate extroverted sensation. One thing that Mark Hunziker talked about in depth typology, he has INTJ preferences. He talked about the importance of developing extroverted sensation as an INJ personality type. And he was saying one of the ways that he did this is by taking walks and hikes in nature. And I think that's a great way to incorporate extroverted sensing if you're a dominant intuitive type. Taking a walk in nature, paying attention to details, and really trying not to get pulled like into your head in all these theoretical musings, but actually paying attention to what's around you. Playing games like ping pong, tennis, things where you have to react and be in your surroundings and pay attention to them. Experimenting with cooking, baking, flavors, and scents. Basically, extroverted sensing is kind of a fun process to really tap into when you can, because it's pretty simple. Just like take some time to tune into the moment, take some time to tap into your senses, and you can find really enjoyable ways to do this. So this is one way. The more you experiment with processes that involve your inferior function, the more you can find yourself comfortable when you have to be in situations that require you to use it. And the less likely it is to bubble up in a negative way during stressful moments. So simple ways to incorporate introverted sensing: taking time to notice sensation and details in depth. You could smell something and notice your reactions and your memories associated with that smell. You could remember a moment that brought you joy and recall the sequence that led to it and see how you can incorporate that into your routine. So maybe during the day, sometime you're like, wow, I really enjoyed this morning routine I had. I got up 15 minutes early. I spent 5 minutes reading a book. I meditated for 5 minutes and I had a cold glass of water. Just paying attention to that routine that led to that positive feeling, and then putting that routine into your life on an ongoing basis can be a way for you to incorporate introverted sensing into your life. And paying attention to your routines and your traditions and seeing which ones are helping you and which ones might be keeping you stuck in a rut or keeping you from growth. Simple ways to incorporate extroverted intuition. When you have a problem, don't just go to the immediate solution. Think of like a dozen different possible solutions to that problem. Think outside the box and really push yourself to like experiment with different strategies than what you just naturally do. Think about an impossible dream. Maybe you've always wanted to go to outer space or something like that, something that you see as impossible. How could you make that or something like that possible? Now, you might not be able to dream your way into going to space, but maybe you could go explore information about it, like go visit a museum about it or research things about that. Go somewhere you've never been. If you have an extroverted intuition or extroverted sensing that you're trying to tap into more, then doing something you've never done before is a great way to do that. It's very, very important. And imagining a positive outcome to a seemingly negative situation is another great way to tap into extroverted intuition. When you're in a situation where you feel like there is absolutely no way I can find any good in this, trying to brainstorm all the positive things that could come out of that and getting creative with that process. Simple ways to incorporate introverted intuition in your life. Spend some time each day in a quiet place and record thoughts and ideas as they come. For me, as an with ENTJ preferences, it's very natural for me to sit down in a quiet space and immediately think of all the things I need to do. And even if you're not an ENTJ, but if you're like a parent or a busy person, that's probably what happens when you sit down in a quiet place. But keeping a notebook handy and giving yourself time to get past the initial rush of other ideas and just allow your brain to rest and come up with ideas and insights as they come. Considering what the assets and details of your life symbolize to you. A lot of times we work for things in our lives and we try to attain things that we think will make us happy, but what do those actually mean to us? What do those actually symbolize to us? And how important are they really? Another great way to incorporate introvert intuition is to imagine your life 5, 10, or 20 years in the future, and what do you see? What ideas does this give to you? I know, I don't know if any of you have read Neuroscience of Personality by Dario Nardi, but I love his book and I love what he's had to say about introverted intuitives and how I don't remember the exact words, but they're really stimulated and inspired by anticipating and envisioning the future, as well as trying to come up with a solution to a complex problem. All right, I'm going to kind of move a little quicker through these other ones because I know we're getting close to the hour being up. So I'll just mention these briefly. Extroverted thinking. You can incorporate this by thinking of a goal you have and finding ways to make it measurable. Doing an if-then exercise to determine your core needs. Sometimes we think we want something in life, like, oh, I want to be rich. But then if we actually think through it, like, if I'm rich, then what happens? And well, then I'll have stability. If I have stability, then what happens? You'll notice if you do this if-then exercise, you can start to understand the things that you're actually looking for. What you might think you want is wealth, but what you really want is some sort of internal security rather than just wealth. Ways to incorporate introverted thinking. Practice being precise in your use of words by thinking of synonyms that best define what you're thinking or saying. Playing a game where you have to think through the consequences of your moves. Extroverted feeling, people watching and noticing how others interact and react to each other. Thinking of the people in your lives who have helped or hurt you and what values did they respect or violate. And then introverted feeling, taking stock of the things that really matter to you on a core level. What things would you devote your life to? What are they? What things would you die for? What are those core values that are so important to you that you would devote your entire life to them? And how can you support those values? Is there a way you can volunteer, or a way you can incorporate your interest in those values in your life in a real way? And this is important for someone like me with ENTJ preferences, because I can say, oh, I really care about the cause of human trafficking, for example. That's always been a big cause for me. But how much of my life am I actually devoting to that? I can get so caught up in the busy work of life and all the stuff that has to be done that I'm not actually supporting that. But when I take time to support something like that, to actively research it and find ways to give to that cause, then I'm getting myself more in touch with the introverted feeling side of my personality. And that's always a healthy thing. And sometimes it can feel a little bit scary, but it's very important. As I said, there is so much more I could go into on this, and it would make an amazing weekend of talking about this, but I know we're coming up to the end of the hour. And so I want to know if anyone has any questions about any of this as we wrap up.
Yeah, just looking at the chat, no questions in the chat, but yeah, please feel free to ask any questions, any comments.
And I know that many of you have written books about type or have been studying type for many, many years. So I know many of you are probably past the level of knowing about this information. But for anyone who is newer to type, or even if you've been studying it for many years, I'm sure that there's dozens of ways to incorporate this information into your day-to-day interactions with people. For me, it's understanding when I'm dealing with my husband or my kids, when I'm stepping on like a vulnerable piece of themselves, and having more patience with how I talk to them about certain things. So, I have an ISFP daughter. If I'm trying to get her to get her life together through extroverted thinking, she's going to get really upset with me. And she's going to feel like I'm attacking her as a person, rather than me, as with ENTJ preferences, actually trying to help. My motives are to help, and hers are, you're attacking me. If I know these things about type, then I can work more effectively with so many different people, because I can frame what I'm trying to say in a much more empathetic way to where they're coming from based on their type preferences. So for me, it's something that I found really valuable every day. And I hope that other people find it valuable as well. If you'd like to get the slides that I put together for this so that you can look at them in your own time, you can email me at susanstorm@psychologyjunkie.com. And I'm more than happy to send a PDF of all these slides to whoever thinks they would be useful. I knew when I was making them that I would not be able to get through it all in an hour. So I would love it if anyone would like to use these at all. I will get those sent out.
Yes, Susan, and when I upload this recording to YouTube, I'll attach the PDF. So if you could send it, I can do that.
Absolutely. I'll do that as soon as this is done.
I'd just like to say, actually, as an ESFP, I really liked the point about tennis as a way to get back into sensation, and it's something that both you and Dario have both said, and I've actually just thought about it myself generally, that when people ask me about what extrovert sensations like, because it's like a tennis match. I feel I'm playing tennis with the world. I'm expecting someone to, lob the ball back at me. But I've noticed that if I'm in a vulnerable place, like if I'm in my inferior function, I'll actually start having tennis matches in my head to try and just get myself out of the inferior function back into the tennis match. And that's something I've noticed I do if I'm in particularly my inferior function. I'm training as a Jungian analyst. When I'm with Jungians a lot, I'm playing tennis in my mind a lot because, it's all intuition with them. So
that's so interesting. I love that. Yeah, I loved what Dario Nardi had to say about the tennis hop brain pattern. And I have two or three extroverted sensing members of my immediate family. And I love how he explained that they're always ready and waiting for a surprise incoming task, and how it's like life can be very dull and boring for them because they're just like, when is the surprise going to happen? And I find it amazing. And I think that's interesting that you do that in your head. I'm gonna have to go ask my ESTP husband if he does that.
and actually with introverted intuition types, what I noticed with, particularly with Jungian analysts who are, I'm just immersed in Jungian training at the minute, is I joke with them that I volley the ball to you guys and you catch the ball and you take it and you go away with it, and they come back 2 weeks later with so that's kind of the dynamics with sensation intuition. So yeah, but I can spot
that's so
a sensation type a mile away because it'll be a tennis match the minute I meet them, and that's when I know I'm with a fellow sensation type.
That is so cool. That's so interesting. Someday I have to meet you and then bring my husband and see how the tennis match goes in real life.
Yeah.
Well, I would just want to say thank you again to everybody who came. I really appreciate it. I know I have a lot to learn from all of you, and I hope that this was helpful. And I just really, really am honored to have had this opportunity. So thank you.